For 16 generations, the Blackthorn family protected a secret the world never knew existed. Hidden behind iron gates and bricked-up windows, they lived and died by one rule: no outsiders, no mixing, no exceptions. They called it purity, a sacred bloodline that must remain untouched. But those who lived nearby whispered another word for it: obsession. For more than a century, the family drifted out of sight, their presence fading into rumor, until one day their silence broke the pattern that had lasted 160 years. No birth announcement, no sign of life, no letter on the registry desk. When investigators finally entered the mansion, they found every adult dead, peaceful, untouched, as if they simply surrendered to something unseen. And in the nursery, untouched by dust or decay, lay a child unlike anything human eyes had ever witnessed, staring, silent, waiting, as though the entire bloodline had lived and died for its arrival point 16 generations ago, long before anyone alive could trace its origin. The vow of pure blood began with a single unsettling decision. The founding ancestor, Elias Blackthorn, was a man obsessed with legacy, convinced that his family possessed something rare, something he claimed was a blessing but others sensed was a curse. He spoke of a gift passed through their blood, a trait that made them chosen, set apart from ordinary humanity. After the mysterious death of his young wife, Elias withdrew from society and declared that no member of his bloodline would ever marry or mix with outsiders again. According to fragmented historical accounts, he believed the world was corrupt, deluded, and unworthy of their lineage, and that only through isolation could their hidden strength continue. Those close to him noted that Elias changed after the birth of his first child. He became fixated on the child's features, tracing the shape of the eyes and jaw as if comparing them to something only he had seen before. He kept meticulous notes, logging the child's growth, behaviors, and inexplicable moments where the infant seemed to stare into empty corners for hours. Elias interpreted these occurrences as signs of the gift awakening, and his obsession deepened. Whispers spread through their small settlement, stories of Elias forbidding doctors or clergy from examining his child, insisting that no outside influence could interfere with what the bloodline carried. When questioned, he only repeated cryptic phrases about purity, continuity, and preparation, though no one understood what he believed he was preparing for. Over time, Elias pressured his other relatives to adopt the same oath, forming a sealed family unit that viewed outsiders with suspicion and disdain. They became increasingly secretive, rarely appearing in public and avoiding all social interaction. Decades passed, and each new generation followed the vow, marrying only within the family, convinced that they were safeguarding something sacred. As the years progressed, people began noticing a disturbing pattern. Every child born into the lineage looked uncannily similar to the parent before them, as though the bloodline was folding in on itself rather than branching outward. Old portraits showed nearly identical faces across generations, unsettling in their sameness. Rumors hinted that the founding ancestor had predicted this, that he wanted the blood to narrow, to refine itself into something singular. The vow was no longer viewed as a tradition but as an unbreakable commandment, etched into the family's identity. The gift became an unspoken promise, and every birth was treated not as a celebration, but as a continuation of a plan no outsider had ever been allowed to understand. By the time the 20th century crept in, the Blackthorn family had already become an eerie fixture of local folklore, but it was in the 1950s that their presence seemed to evaporate entirely. For generations, they had maintained minimal interaction with the outside world, only appearing when absolutely necessary, but at least townspeople could occasionally catch distant glimpses of them on the estate grounds, moving like pale shadows between the trees or riding in covered carriages that never stopped long enough for anyone to see their faces clearly. Then, without warning, the sightings ended. The iron gates of Blackthorn Hollow, once occasionally opened for supply deliveries or rare business matters, were sealed shut with thick chains. Windows that had once been dark but visible were suddenly bricked over, as if the family no longer needed light or no longer wanted the world to see what lived within. Workmen hired to make these modifications arrived from out of town, refused to speak about what they saw, and left before sunset each day, never returning once the job was complete. The estate transformed from a private residence into a silent fortress, a place that felt less like a home and more like a tomb that someone was deliberately sealing. Despite this withdrawal, proof of the Blackthorns' continued existence surfaced in a single chilling ritual. Once every decade, without fail, a letter was delivered to the town registry office. It arrived without postage, without a courier, simply appearing on the desk overnight as though placed there by an unseen hand. The envelope was thick, sealed with the familiar wax emblem of tangled roots, and inside was a single slip of parchment bearing a newborn's name, date of birth, and a generational number. No explanations, no signatures, no requests. Just confirmation that another heir had been born and the bloodline lived on. The handwriting never changed across the decades, matching records from nearly a century earlier, a detail that unsettled anyone tasked with comparing the documents. It was as though time inside the estate did not move the same way it did outside. Rumors spread through the town about what was happening behind the bricked walls and chained gates. Some believed disease had struck the family, forcing them into quarantine, while others whispered darker theories, that the family was hiding deformities from generations of inbreeding or practicing forbidden rituals that required absolute secrecy. Hunters who ventured too close to the forest surrounding the estate claimed to hear faint cries or low chanting carried on the wind, sounds that stopped abruptly if anyone approached the fence line. The absence of physical presence only amplified the family's spectral reputation, and Blackthorn Hollow became a place children were dared to go near, but adults refused to approach. The decades of silence created a void that felt intentional, as though the family was not merely hiding from the world, but separating themselves in preparation for something they believed only their blood was destined to fulfill. When the announcement of the 16th generation arrived, the town registered it with the same uneasy acceptance as all the others, assuming the ritual would continue, as it always had. But the decade that followed felt different from the start. The usual whispers about odd lights behind the estate walls and distant cries in the woods fell strangely silent. Hunters who once claimed to hear movement near the boundary heard nothing at all, not even the rustle of leaves or the distant echo of footsteps. Delivery workers who had occasionally approached the outer gate found it untouched by weather or wear, as if no one inside had opened it in years. Even the forest around Blackthorn Hollow seemed wrong, its trees brittle and bowed, as though drained of life. The air near the estate felt heavier, colder, and people spoke of an unsettling stillness settling over the region, like a held breath that refused to release. Still, the silence might have gone unchallenged if not for the missing letter. Exactly 10 years after the previous announcement, local officials waited, uneasy but expectant, knowing that at any moment the familiar wax-sealed envelope would appear on the registry desk. Days passed, then weeks. Clerks checked every morning, some driven more by morbid curiosity than duty, but nothing appeared. It was the first time in 160 years that the ritual had been broken, and the absence felt louder than any presence could have. The missing letter was not just an administrative anomaly. It was a fracture in a pattern so rigid and precise that even skeptics found themselves unsettled. Soon the matter escalated beyond whispered concern, reaching government agencies tasked with welfare and oversight. The Blackthorn family, though notoriously private, was still legally bound to report births, deaths, and census data, and the complete lack of communication triggered suspicion. Records showed no medical visits, no property tax signatures, no documented activity for over a decade. It was as if the entire family had vanished into the walls of their own estate. A welfare investigation was ordered, though no one volunteered willingly. The assignment fell to an officer named Daniel Hargrove, chosen by protocol rather than desire, who read through decades of sparse records and tried to make sense of the strange legacy he was about to confront. Before he even set foot on the estate grounds, townspeople warned him in hushed voices, insisting that the family's silence was intentional, that whatever lived behind those walls was not meant to be disturbed. Yet the law required a response, and the broken ritual left no room for complacency. The silence surrounding Blackthorn Hollow had shifted from eerie tradition to alarming possibility, and with no letter to reassure the world that the bloodline continued, the void demanded answers, drawing the first outsider toward the gates in generations, unaware that he was stepping into the aftermath of something far older and far darker than neglect when Daniel Hargrove finally passed through the rusted gates of Blackthorn Hollow. He expected neglect, illness, maybe a family too afraid to face the world, but nothing could have prepared him for the suffocating stillness that greeted him. The mansion loomed like a carcass of stone, its bricked windows blotting out any hint of life. Inside, a thick layer of dust coated the floors, undisturbed by footprints, as if no one had walked the halls in years. Yet there was no smell of decay, no signs of struggle, no frantic messages left behind. Room after room revealed the same chilling sight. Entire generations of adults seated in chairs or resting on beds, their bodies eerily preserved, skin pale but intact, faces frozen in calm expressions that suggested resignation rather than panic. There were no wounds, no signs of poisoning or disease, nothing to mark the cause of death. It was as though they had simply stopped living at the same moment, silently and willingly. Daniel checked pulses, searched for documents, tried to call in backup, but his radio emitted only static, and every clock in the house was halted at the same exact time, down to the second, as though time itself had obeyed some command within the walls. Then came the nursery. At the end of a long corridor, behind a door that felt colder to the touch than any other surface in the mansion, Daniel found a single room untouched by dust, its walls painted with faded symbols resembling twisted roots and spirals. In the center of the room sat a cradle, and inside it was the child. Small, impossibly still, its skin almost translucent, the infant didn't cry or move, just stared with eyes so entirely black they seemed like bottomless voids. There were no whites, no reflections, only darkness that absorbed the dim light. Daniel felt an instinctive fear, not because the child appeared sick or deformed, but because it felt aware, as if it recognized him. Medical teams arrived hours later and confirmed the impossible. The adults were all dead, synchronized in death, without trauma or decay, as though preserved by some unseen mechanism. The child, however, was perfectly healthy in terms of vitals, but exhibited none of the typical behaviors of a newborn. It did not respond to touch or sound, nor did it close its eyes. DNA testing began immediately, expected to reveal the predictable effects of inbreeding, but what emerged instead defied all scientific logic. The child's genome did not match any known human patterns, missing markers fundamental to the species and containing sequences no database had ever recorded. It wasn't a case of mutation or anomaly. It was an entirely foreign structure, a genetic blueprint that suggested the child wasn't merely different from its lineage, but separate from humanity altogether. The discovery turned the investigation from a welfare check into a mystery that shook every expert involved, leaving them questioning not just what the child was, but what the bloodline had been preparing for all along. Once the child was transferred to the research facility, everyone involved assumed the terror of the mansion had been left behind. But the unease followed them into sterile hallways and brightly lit labs where logic was supposed to rule. At first, the staff dismissed their discomfort as nerves, a natural response to handling something so unprecedented, yet the tension in the air grew heavier with every passing hour. The infant remained motionless in its glass-walled observation chamber, lying with its eyes open, unblinking, its gaze fixed on corners of the room where nothing existed. Technicians reported a strange sensation when standing near the chamber, as if the air vibrated softly, too low to hear, but strong enough to feel. It wasn't until a night shift assistant named Marlowe spoke up that anyone dared voice what others had been hiding. He claimed that while logging the child's vitals, he heard faint whispers behind him, a string of sounds that didn't match any known language yet felt intentional, rhythmic, almost ritualistic. When he turned, the room was empty. The security tapes showed he was alone, but the microphone feeding into the central system recorded a soft murmur that didn't match his voice. Soon others admitted similar experiences, whispers repeating the same indistinguishable phrase, always heard near the observation glass, never anywhere else. The facility tried to rationalize it as interference, a mechanical glitch, or shared stress, but the incidents escalated. Cameras trained on the child captured footage that contradicted reality. In one recording, The infant appeared to stand upright in a corner of the chamber, motionless for 7 full minutes, despite no one entering the room and no indication of movement between frames. In another clip, the child was seen lying in its cradle, then suddenly appearing on the opposite side of the room, without any footage showing how it crossed the space. Experts reviewed the videos repeatedly, searching for edits, jumps, or malfunctions, but the feed was uninterrupted and clean. Every time the footage froze on the child's eyes, the image distorted slightly, as though the lens struggled to comprehend what it was capturing. Staff began refusing night shifts, some claiming that when they walked past the chamber, the whispering grew louder and seemed to echo inside their heads rather than through their ears. One nurse reported feeling watched even with her back turned, insisting she could sense the child's gaze tracking her movements. Attempts to sedate the infant failed. Its body showed no chemical response, and its pulse never changed, as if nothing in the physical world could alter it. The longer the child remained, the more the facility felt less like a place of science and more like a threshold, a border where something unseen was pressing inward, using the newborn as a conduit, and every whisper suggested that whatever the Blackthorn bloodline had nurtured was now awake and aware, no longer confined to the walls of the forgotten estate. The turning point began when investigators, desperate for context, returned to Blackthorn Hollow to search for records that might explain the impossible child. Hidden behind a false wall in the study, they discovered a series of leather-bound journals, some so old the ink had bled into the pages, others written only years before the family's demise. These diaries revealed that the pure blood vow was never about pride or heritage, but part of an intentional design that stretched back to Elias Blackthorn himself. His earliest writings spoke of visions, fragmented dreams he claimed weren't dreams at all, but messages from something he called the source beneath, an unseen presence he believed communicated through blood. He wrote that the bloodline carried a fragment of this presence, dormant but waiting, and that each generation would strengthen it by refusing any dilution from the outside world. Later entries from successive descendants echoed Elias's words with unnerving precision, as if the same voice guided each writer, using their hands to continue the same ominous narrative. The language remained consistent across time, referencing preparation, vessel, and emergence, suggesting a shared purpose rather than independent belief. One journal from the 9th generation described strange occurrences in newborns, moments when they stared into dark corners, and parents claimed to hear faint whispers coming from their cradles. Instead of being alarmed, the family saw these signs as progress, proof that the bloodline was nearing the moment Elias had foretold. They measured each child's behavior, recording the exact similarities across generations, noting that the children's features remained unchanged, as if the blood was molding them into a single identity. As the entries advanced into the 20th century, the tone shifted from reverent to urgent. Members of the family wrote of feeling watched from inside their own minds, of dreams that were no longer dreams but commands, and of an internal presence that seemed to be growing stronger. One journal chillingly stated that the family did not fear death because they believed their bodies were temporary containers, meant only to carry the blood until the final generation was born. The most recent entries, written less than a year before the family's discovery, detailed a ritual they called the final narrowing, a belief that once the bloodline reached its purest state, humanity would fall away, leaving only the true essence the family had been cultivating. The writer spoke of a child unlike any before, a culmination rather than a continuation, a being that would not inherit the family's traits, but replace them entirely. They wrote that the adults had begun hearing a voice not outside but within, telling them their purpose was nearly fulfilled and that their physical forms were no longer necessary, leaving the implication that the synchronized deaths were not accidental but voluntary. A collective surrender meant to clear the way for whatever was destined to awaken in the 16th generation. The 7th day after the child's discovery began like any other, sterile and controlled, with doctors monitoring vitals and scientists debating theories that never fit the evidence. But beneath the routine, there was a growing tension none of them could name. The infant had never cried, never blinked, never shown the slightest reaction to the world around it. Yet every person who entered the observation wing reported an inexplicable feeling, as if the walls were holding their breath. At 3:12 a.m., when the facility was at its quietest, monitors tracking the child's heart rate began to flicker, and alarms that should have blared stayed eerily silent. A lone technician noticed the heart rate slowing, then flatlining entirely, the straight line on the screen marking the cessation of life. Protocol demanded emergency intervention, yet when medical staff rushed into the chamber, they found the child lying exactly as before, eyes wide open, its expression unchanged, its skin showing no signs of death. Despite the flatlined vitals, the room felt oppressively charged, as if filled with an unseen current. One nurse reported that the temperature dropped instantly, leaving her breath visible in the air even though the facility's systems showed no mechanical failure. Before anyone could attempt resuscitation, every light in the corridor shattered simultaneously, plunging the wing into darkness as glass rained down like brittle hail. Emergency generators failed to activate, and handheld radios emitted only a low, vibrating hum that seemed to resonate in the chest rather than the ear. In the control room, computers flickered back to life one by one, not displaying system reboots, but forming a single word across every monitor, repeating in stark white letters, "Return." The word pulsed rhythmically, synchronized with an inaudible beat, almost like a heartbeat that no longer belonged to the child's body but to the space itself. Staff members watching through the observation window swore they saw the infant sit upright without any visible movement, as if lifted by an unseen force, its eyes reflecting no light, just endless darkness. Surveillance footage later confirmed the motion but offered no explanation, no shift in musculature, no preparatory movement, simply one frame with the child lying still and the next with it seated. Some witnesses reported hearing a low chorus of whispers rising from the walls, growing louder until it filled their minds rather than their ears, a soundless pressure that made several collapse to their knees. When backup teams finally restored power, the child's vitals suddenly returned, showing a strong, steady pulse that defied the flatline recorded moments earlier. Yet the medical data left no doubt. For several minutes, the infant had registered as clinically dead while remaining alert, staring, unblinking, as if conscious on a level no human physiology could support. The event marked a shift that everyone felt but could not articulate, a sense that the child was no longer dormant or observing but active, aware, and aligned with something beyond the boundaries of the physical world, as though a threshold had been crossed, and whatever the Blackthorn lineage had been preparing for was no longer approaching. It had begun. The aftermath of the seventh night left the facility shaken, but the unanswered questions drove investigators back to the bloodline itself, pushing them to search for physical evidence in the past rather than the present. With legal authorization and growing concern that the Blackthorn history might conceal biological dangers, a team began exhuming graves from the family's private cemetery, expecting the typical signs of genetic deterioration or inherited disease. Instead, what they uncovered defied every assumption. The coffins were pristine despite their age, untouched by rot or soil damage, as if protected from decay by an unknown force. When the first skull was examined, the forensic team froze. It wasn't marked by trauma from outside impact. Instead, it bore a long, precise fissure that ran from the crown downward, splitting the bone from within. Further examination revealed that the break wasn't caused post-mortem. The bone had fractured outward, implying that pressure originated inside the skull, as though something had pushed to escape rather than penetrate. As more graves were unearthed, the pattern repeated. Each member of the lineage, across multiple generations, displayed the same internal rupture, the same outward fracture, and none showed typical signs of decomposition. Tissue samples, where available, suggested that cellular breakdown had paused unnaturally, with remnants far too preserved for their supposed age. Scientists attempted to rationalize the findings as rare pathology or unusual burial conditions, but no known disease or environmental factor could account for synchronized internal cranial fractures across centuries. The unsettling truth grew harder to ignore. The Blackthorns hadn't been dying naturally. Their bodies had become containers for something that exerted force from within. Compounding the horror, genetic tests taken from bone marrow revealed a gradual shift across generations. Early ancestors showed typical human markers, but as the lineage progressed, Human sequences diminished while unidentified genetic elements increased, culminating in the 16th generation, where almost none of the original human code remained. The data suggested a transformation rather than degeneration, an intentional replacement of human biology with something foreign. Investigators realized that the child found in the mansion wasn't a mutation or a tragic endpoint of isolation. It was the anticipated outcome, the full emergence of whatever had been building within the bloodline. The journal's references to a vessel and a final narrowing no longer seemed like delusions, but documentation of a long-term conversion, with each generation serving as a stage in a process. The synchronized deaths of the adults aligned chillingly with the genetic conclusions, implying their bodies had reached a point of obsolescence, their purpose completed. The graves confirmed that every previous generation had contained the early stages of the same force that now existed fully formed in the infant. The realization settled over the investigation like a suffocating weight. The child was not the last of the Blackthorns. It was the first of whatever the Blackthorns had been preparing to create, the beginning of something that had never been human to begin with.